Ava Brown had always taken pride in her role at St. Luke's Hospital, believing that her work went beyond a paycheck, it was a calling. She was the nurse who volunteered for the toughest night shifts, comforted distraught patients with her steady presence, and never hesitated to stand up for those too frightened or weak to speak for themselves. However, in an institution still tainted by unspoken biases, her commitment often felt like a thankless battle. While some co-workers treated her with genuine warmth, others shot her subtle, judgmental looks that chipped away at her confidence one glance at a time. Ava sensed it the moment she overheard hushed discussions about budget cuts and staff reductions, always followed by a sidelong peek in her direction. When she received the official termination notice, it felt like a hollow confirmation of what she'd feared all along: her race was the issue nobody wanted to name. The department head recited a polite litany of reasons: corporate downsizing, organizational restructuring, but he wouldn't look her in the eye. Ava forced herself to remain stoic, even as her heart hammered in her chest. The logic was paper-thin, especially considering she had more seniority and stronger performance reviews than several co-workers who kept their jobs. She silently recalled the times she'd endured offhand remarks about her hair, or that awkward moment when a patient's family demanded a more qualified nurse after seeing she was black. Each memory stung her pride and validated her lingering suspicion that she was never truly seen as an equal in those corridors. Walking out of St. Luke's for the last time, she felt an unsettling mix of grief and anger. This hospital had been her refuge after nursing school, a place she once trusted with her ambition to bring healing and hope. Now, under the guise of budgetary concerns, it was casting her aside. A damp chill clung to the Manhattan air, mirroring the cold knot of resentment forming in her stomach. As she clutched her worn leather bag and tried to steady her trembling hands, Ava could practically taste the injustice. Still, she refused to crumble. Stepping onto the crowded sidewalk, she remembered why she had chosen this profession in the first place. She thought of the countless patients she'd nurtured, the grateful smiles that made every overtime shift worthwhile. No one could erase that dedication, even if they stripped her of a hospital badge. Yet she couldn't deny the burning question that haunted her: was this firing simply budgetary, or had she been singled out because of her race? That question followed her, pressing into her thoughts like a persistent ache. With each determined stride, Ava resolved to continue her fight for equal treatment, if not at St. Luke's, then somewhere that valued her skill and humanity. However, fate had a different plan. In mere moments, she would stumble upon a crisis on the street, save a life in plain sight, and propel herself into a high-stakes confrontation with the very prejudices she could no longer escape. The stage was set for a reckoning that would challenge not only her professional future, but her faith in a society where racial divides still ran painfully deep. Ava Brown stepped off the curb, each footfall echoing her determination to move forward despite the weight of injustice hanging over her. The Manhattan sidewalks bustled with people who seemed to ignore her completely, until a sudden commotion broke through the everyday din. A man in a tailored suit lay collapsed on the concrete, his skin ashen and his breath faint. Curious onlookers formed a loose circle around him, uncertain and hesitant. Ava's instincts flared. She was a nurse, trained to handle emergencies, and although St. Luke's Hospital had just cast her aside, her sense of duty refused to waver. She pushed through the crowd, noticing the fleeting grimaces and sidelong glances. More than one person seemed dubious about her competence. Perhaps it was the memory of her hospital badge, or maybe it was the simple fact of her skin color that triggered their skepticism. Either way, she refused to let those looks stop her. Kneeling down, she checked the man's pulse, found it dangerously weak, and launched into CPR. The act felt almost automatic: press, release, timed perfectly to the silent count in her head. Whispers rippled through the crowd: is she qualified? Someone call a real doctor. Ava heard the words, their undertones sharp with prejudice. Adrenaline pumped through her veins, and she forced herself to block out the toxic static around her. Her focus had to remain on saving this stranger's life, no matter what labels people placed on her. After several tense moments, the man's eyelids fluttered, and he drew in a ragged breath. Relief washed over Ava, though she kept her composure, guiding him onto his side to ensure he could breathe properly. As the paramedics arrived, they glanced at Ava with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity, almost as if they couldn't believe that an out-of-work nurse, recently thrown away by a top hospital, had just stabilized a man who appeared to be someone of influence. One of the EMTs quickly checked his vitals, then turned to Ava with a nod. "Good job," he said simply, acknowledging her life-saving intervention. Ava stood, her knees aching from the hard pavement. She noticed the embroidered initials on the man's suit jacket, RL. She vaguely recognized them as belonging to Richard Lawson, a powerful CEO whose name sometimes surfaced in hushed conversations about Manhattan's elite. Unsure of what else to do, and wanting to avoid any further scrutiny, Ava backed away. Cameras from smartphones and bystanders' stares followed her retreat. She slipped into the throng of commuters, her heart pounding as she tried to process what had just happened. A swirl of conflicting emotions flooded her, pride in her training, anger at the judgment she'd faced, and an uneasy curiosity about the man she'd just rescued. Still fresh from her own dismissal, she had no idea how this single, spontaneous act of compassion would change the direction of her life. If there was one thing she did understand, it was that the line between prejudice and opportunity can blur in an instant, especially in a city where power and bias intersect every single day. Ava Brown had barely slept after her whirlwind day. Thoughts of St. Luke's lingered in her mind, especially the unspoken prejudice that had hounded her for years, mingling with the memory of saving the man identified as Richard Lawson. She kept replaying the scene on the sidewalk, the skeptical stares, the whispers that questioned her ability, and the moment she heard him gasp for air. Each replay stoked a quiet anger, but also a fragile sense of hope. She had proven, once again, that her skills and compassion didn't vanish just because an institution tried to dismiss her. Early the next morning, her phone buzzed on the edge of the chipped coffee table. Ava stared at the unfamiliar number for a moment before reluctantly pressing answer. A measured, confident voice greeted her. "Ms. Brown? This is James Lawson. You saved my father's life yesterday." Instinct told Ava to steel herself, she wasn't used to wealthy men calling her personally. The recollection of subtle bigotry and social divides gnawed at her confidence. Still, she remained polite. "How is he doing?" she asked, her tone cool but civil. James Lawson explained that Richard was stable and recovering, thanks in large part to Ava's quick intervention. "He'd like to meet you, if you're willing," James added. Ava felt her pulse quicken. Under normal circumstances, a gesture of gratitude would be welcome. But she couldn't ignore the possibility that this might come wrapped in the same prejudice she'd been battling her entire career. She hesitated, recalling the dismissive glances and the hush that often fell whenever she walked into a predominantly white environment. Nevertheless, James sounded sincere, at least on the surface. Against her better judgment, she agreed to a brief meeting that afternoon. She reasoned that if she was to continue fighting for her place in a society that so often doubted her capabilities, any opportunity to demonstrate her worth, or to confront prejudice head-on, couldn't be dismissed out of hand. When she arrived at the cafe James had chosen, Ava could practically feel the eyes of the upscale patrons skimming over her natural curls, her modest attire, and her darker complexion. Their facial expressions seemed polite enough, but a few of them wore that tight-lipped smile she recognized all too well, polite tolerance rather than genuine acceptance. James Lawson stood to greet her, his posture radiating the confidence of someone who'd never had to question his place in the world. After a quick handshake, he offered her a seat across from him. "I want to personally thank you for what you did," he began, his gaze steady. Ava studied him, noticing how carefully he chose his words. She wondered if he was tiptoeing around the subject of race, or if he was one of those rare individuals who understood how serious these issues could be. He cleared his throat. "My father is, well, a complicated man. He's also deeply grateful to you. We'd appreciate it if you'd come see him." Despite the praise, Ava remained guarded. Memories of St. Luke's still weighed on her, an institution that claimed to be progressive yet never fully embraced her presence. She glanced around at the pristine cafe and wondered if the Lawsons were merely another manifestation of the same culture that had cast her aside. Yet something in James's voice suggested there might be more to this meeting than hollow gratitude. Her heart pounded as she answered, aware she was stepping into unknown territory. "All right, Mr. Lawson. I'll see your father." And with that promise, she braced herself for whatever prejudices or opportunities lay just beyond the cafe doors. Ava's heart thrummed with a mix of apprehension and curiosity as she followed James Lawson into the sleek, upscale restaurant he had chosen for their second meeting. It was the kind of place where the host greeted patrons by name, and where the well-dressed clientele paused their conversations only long enough to glance disdainfully at anyone who seemed out of place. Ava could almost feel the unspoken question in the air, what is she doing here? As unsettling as it was, she couldn't let her nerves override her resolve. She had agreed to see what the Lawsons wanted, and she intended to hear them out, even if she suspected there was more nuance to their offer than simple gratitude. They were ushered to a private booth by a neatly uniformed waiter whose polite smile barely concealed a flicker of suspicion. Ava recognized that fleeting expression all too well. It was the look people gave when they were trying to reconcile her poise and confidence with their preconceptions about her race. For a moment, anger flared inside her, then she quelled it with a practiced calm. This wasn't the first time she'd faced a silent insinuation that she didn't belong, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Once seated, James leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "I want to be direct," he began, his tone carefully measured. "My father isn't just a private citizen. He's one of the most influential business figures in New York." Ava nodded, having already guessed as much from the name Richard Lawson. "He feels he owes you his life," James continued, "and he doesn't take that lightly. Frankly, he wants to ensure your future is taken care of." Ava studied James's features, searching for any overt condescension. His eyes flickered with an undercurrent of caution, as though he was testing her reaction. Could he be genuinely earnest? She wondered. Or was this the veiled language of someone who thought money could resolve every issue, including deep-rooted prejudice? When James slid a slim white envelope across the table, Ava exhaled a shaky breath. Inside was a check for an amount that made her eyes widen, a figure that could pay off her student loans and still leave enough to secure housing for years. James offered a tight-lipped smile. "It's a gesture of appreciation," he explained, "for saving my father's life." For a moment, Ava was speechless. Having just been fired, she knew how transformative such a sum could be. But a knot formed in her stomach as she glanced around, recalling the stares and whispers. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than generosity, it was a transaction. "I didn't save him for a reward," she said firmly, pushing the check back toward James. His eyes flickered with surprise, and maybe even respect, though it was laced with something else. She recognized the momentary tension in his jaw, a sign of someone who wasn't used to hearing no. Clearing his throat, James leaned in again. "There's more," he added. "My father wants to offer you a job, as his personal medical advisor." Ava's brow furrowed. She tried to imagine what that might entail. A private nurse for a high-profile CEO? Even at a glance, it was a golden opportunity that could solve her immediate financial crisis. But the specter of prejudice loomed. In her mind, she could already envision the whispered judgments from those who assumed she was out of her depth. "He wants you to live on our family estate," James continued. "Full benefits, your own quarters, triple your old salary." He paused, letting the words sink in. "He believes it's the least he can do." Ava felt her pulse pounding. A part of her resented the implication that she needed to be rescued. Yet another part, the pragmatic part, recognized how rare this chance was, especially after St. Luke's had so callously discarded her. She stiffened her spine, recalling the stifling sense of unfairness that still clung to her. Money and titles wouldn't erase the discrimination she'd suffered, but maybe this position would grant her the platform to prove herself yet again, and force a reckoning with those who refused to see past her race. "That's a generous offer," she said cautiously, keeping her voice steady. She hesitated, aware she stood at a crossroads that would shape her future. James nodded, carefully observing her reaction. In his gaze, she saw both intrigue and a subtle wariness, a silent admission that, for all his family's power, they could not buy her acceptance. Only time would reveal whether this new door would alleviate, or further entrench, the very prejudices that had haunted her since her first day at St. Luke's. Ava Brown stood in the soaring marble lobby of Lawson Enterprises, feeling every curious glance that settled on her as she waited for James Lawson to escort her upstairs. Polished floors reflected the high heels and expensive shoes of executives passing by, their hushed conversations echoing against tall glass walls. A sophisticated security desk dominated the entrance, where uniformed guards monitored every arrival with cool detachment. The opulence was undeniable, so was the sense that she was an outsider in this realm of wealth and influence. James eventually appeared, greeting her with a brisk handshake. Despite his attempts at warmth, she noticed the polite tightness in his smile, like he was still learning how to navigate having her in his father's space. He guided her to the private elevator, punching in a keycard code that granted access to the top floor. Even inside the sleek, mirror-paneled car, she couldn't escape her own reflection, a dedicated nurse of color who had been treated like a dispensable asset by one institution, now finding herself on the threshold of another. As the doors slid open, Richard Lawson himself waited in a plush reception area. He rose slowly, still recovering from his medical scare, but his tailored suit and resolute posture exuded power. "Ava," he said, voice reverberating with unspoken authority, "thank you for coming. I trust my son has explained the arrangement." She nodded, swallowing the nerves that threatened to tighten her throat. "He's mentioned a position as your personal medical advisor," she replied, trying to maintain composure under his piercing gaze. Richard gestured for her to follow him into a corner office framed by floor-to-ceiling windows. Beyond the pristine glass stretched a panoramic view of Manhattan, skyscrapers glinting in the afternoon sun, street grids bustling far below. A sense of vertigo mingled with awe as Ava took in the sight. She reminded herself that no matter how impressive the setting, it didn't erase her experiences of prejudice or the subtle hostility she had encountered at St. Luke's. "Please, have a seat," Richard offered, easing himself into a leather chair. James stood behind him, arms folded. "You saved my life," he continued, his tone more solemn now. "It's only fair I offer you something in return, an opportunity, to put it bluntly." Ava recognized the hint of pride woven through his gratitude. Wealth had clearly accustomed him to having his way. Yet there was something else, too, perhaps genuine respect for her skills. She felt the weight of his words. This was more than a job, it was an invitation into a world she suspected operated by different rules. "I'd like you to monitor my health day to day," Richard went on, "and assist with any medical needs, whether at home or on the road. The salary will be triple whatever you earned at St. Luke's. Accommodations on my estate, full benefits. No detail overlooked." Pausing, he eyed her carefully. "Of course, I expect confidentiality and loyalty. You'll see things, business dealings, personal affairs, that require discretion. I trust that won't be a problem." Ava bristled momentarily at the implication. She knew the question wasn't purely professional, it also carried an undercurrent of suspicion about her background. Nevertheless, she kept her voice steady. "I'm a nurse, Mr. Lawson. Confidentiality and loyalty are part of the profession." Richard inclined his head, seemingly satisfied. "Good," he said simply. "Then we have an understanding." Yet Ava couldn't ignore the gnawing reminder that prejudice didn't vanish just because she now sat in a luxurious office. In fact, it might grow even more insidious in these upper echelons of power. All the same, she answered with quiet resolve, determined to prove her worth in a place that might never fully accept her. Yes, she said at last. I'm ready to begin. After accepting the position as Richard Lawson's personal medical advisor, Ava Brown began her new chapter at the Lawson estate. Part of her compensation was a guest house on the sprawling property, a modest dwelling nestled behind manicured gardens and towering pillars of the main mansion. On her first evening, as she unpacked her few belongings, she couldn't help but feel a heavy mix of anticipation and apprehension. This guest house was meant to be her sanctuary, yet the subtle hostility simmering just beyond its walls was impossible to ignore. From the moment she set foot on the estate, Ava sensed the prying eyes of the household staff. The head housekeeper, Ms. Jenkins, regarded her with a stiff, almost frosty politeness that barely concealed a deep-seated resentment. "Welcome to your new home, Miss Brown," she said curtly, her tone laced with an unspoken message, "you're not really one of us." Later that day, while Ava was tending to a few medical supplies in the guest house, she overheard a conversation among the kitchen staff. Whispers floated through the hall about how someone like her didn't belong in a place of such refinement, a place reserved for those of certain pedigree and background. The tension grew more palpable as the days passed. During a routine dinner in the mansion's private dining room, Ava couldn't escape the occasional sidelong glance or the barely veiled snickers from a few longtime staff members. Their casual use of stereotypes and dismissive comments, cloaked in feigned concern, made her painfully aware that despite her undeniable competence, her presence as an African American woman was viewed as an anomaly. Even James Lawson, who had been her initial advocate, slipped into microaggressive remarks on more than one occasion. In a quiet moment after a staff meeting, he muttered, "I hope you can handle all of this without any trouble," his tone implying that her background might somehow be a liability in this elite circle. Yet, despite the constant barrage of subtle and overt discrimination, Ava resolved to maintain her professionalism. Each day, as she navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the estate, she clung tightly to the belief that her skills and compassionate care would speak louder than any prejudiced remark. In her interactions with the staff, she made a concerted effort to be courteous and collaborative, all while silently standing against the demeaning attitudes that permeated every interaction. She began to document small moments of exclusion, comments made in hushed tones, the deliberate isolation at staff gatherings, as evidence of a system that, despite its glittering surface, was marred by deep-rooted biases. Inside her modest guest house, Ava often reflected on the irony of her situation. Here she was, entrusted with the health and well-being of a powerful family, yet confined to a role that was constantly undermined by the same elitist prejudices that had cost her her previous job at St. Luke's. The more she observed, the more she recognized that the Lawson estate was a microcosm of a broader societal issue, a society where one's skin color still dictated one's worth and belonging. Though the environment was fraught with challenges, Ava was determined not to be crushed by the weight of discrimination. She steeled herself every morning, resolved to not only fulfill her responsibilities with excellence but also to gradually break down the barriers of bias that threatened to keep her marginalized. In the quiet solitude of her guest house, amidst whispered contempt and occasional microaggressions, Ava vowed that her presence, and her unwavering dedication, would one day pave the way for a more inclusive future in a world that too often equated privilege with purity. In the weeks that followed, Ava Brown's quiet resolve grew stronger with each challenge she faced on the Lawson estate. Despite the luxurious trappings of her new environment, the undercurrents of racial prejudice never ceased to remind her that acceptance here was still a distant ideal. Every whispered remark from the staff, every sidelong glance during meetings, and every microaggression she encountered fueled a deep, personal determination to rise above the discrimination that had shadowed her entire career. Late one rainy evening, after a particularly trying day filled with cold stares and thinly veiled dismissals, Ava found herself alone in the quiet sanctuary of her guest house. The steady patter of rain on the windowpane mirrored the rhythm of her thoughts. She recalled the painful dismissal from St. Luke's, an institution that had masked its bias under the guise of budget cuts, and the skeptical whispers on Manhattan sidewalks as she performed life-saving CPR. In that moment of solitude, she resolved that her journey was not just about survival or financial stability, but about reclaiming her dignity and proving her worth in a system that too often judged her by the color of her skin rather than the strength of her character. Determined to make a tangible difference, Ava began to document every incident of prejudice she encountered on the estate. With a discreet notebook hidden away in her bag, she recorded the dismissive tones, the casual yet cutting comments, and the overt acts of exclusion that painted a grim picture of the deep-seated racism permeating the walls of Lawson Enterprises. This meticulous record became her silent testament to the injustices she faced, a reminder that her struggle was not isolated but part of a broader societal failing that needed to be acknowledged and confronted. Yet, in the midst of adversity, Ava's commitment to her profession never wavered. She continued to attend to the health needs of the Lawson family with the same unwavering compassion that had once earned her accolades at St. Luke's. Each patient she cared for, every life she helped sustain, served as a powerful counterpoint to the prejudice she encountered. Her expertise and empathy shone through, gradually earning the reluctant respect of some colleagues, even if that respect was tinged with the same underlying bias that she had long battled. Ava's internal strength also sparked subtle changes in her interactions. In meetings where she had previously remained silent in the face of condescension, she now spoke up with a measured confidence. Her words, laced with both professionalism and personal conviction, began to challenge the status quo. Slowly, her determination to break down barriers began to inspire a few sympathetic voices among the staff, even if change was not immediate. By the end of that tumultuous period, Ava had come to understand that her journey was only beginning. The world around her, despite its glittering wealth and power, was marred by a persistent intolerance that could not be swept aside by a generous salary or a prestigious title. Instead, she embraced her role as a quiet revolutionary, an individual whose every act of care and courage served as a beacon of hope for those marginalized by a prejudiced society. And as she looked out over the sprawling estate from her modest window, Ava silently vowed that her fight against racial discrimination would continue, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been made to feel less than human. Ava Brown's journey teaches us that resilience and integrity can shine even in the darkest moments of injustice. Despite facing deep-rooted racial discrimination and exclusion, Ava remained steadfast in her commitment to care, proving that one's worth is defined not by others' biases but by unwavering courage and compassion. Her story reminds us that every setback can become a stepping stone to personal growth and positive change when we confront prejudice head-on and document every moment of our struggle. In our everyday lives, we can choose to stand against discrimination, support one another, and work together to build a more inclusive community. If Ava's experience resonates with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please like, comment, and subscribe to join our conversation and share your own stories of overcoming adversity. Your support means the world to me, and together, we can make a difference.